One of the unsung heroes of capitalism is Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch.
My name is Charles II.
Who came to the throne in 1660 in the Restoration after 11 miserable years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell and the Interregnum. Charles II is not really a hero for anything he actually did, but rather for what he did not do. The Puritans were hardly bastions of laissez-faire, anything-goes economic policies. Famously, of course, they banned Christmas, banned dancing and games, and shut down the theatres, which had been established by people like William Shakespeare. One would think that abolishing an absolute monarchy would lead normal people to have more freedom as opposed to less freedom, but as you can see, nothing could be further from the truth. There was virtually no area of private life in which the Puritans did not seek to intervene with the long arm of the government. Now, say what you want about Charles II, but when he was restored to the throne in 1660, he immediately removed many of the rules and regulations that Cromwell and Co. had put in place. He reopened the theatres, which were immediately packed out. He relaxed building laws to allow London to grow beyond the confines of the medieval city, which had been constrained by overcautious leaders in the past.
I'm the king who brought back partying.
Then, as this growth was taking shape, London faced two terrible catastrophes. First, in 1665, the plague wiped out a large chunk of its population, about 100,000 people in the summer, with people still dying at a rate of 7,000 a week in September of that year. And then in 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed over 10,000 homes, 87 churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the city's public buildings. Over 400 acres of warehousing, shops and homes were destroyed. In the aftermath of plague and the Great Fire, 1/5 of the population of London had been wiped out. Now, in the face of this devastation, did Charles II inject a massive fiscal stimulus package to help rebuild London? No, he didn't. The sum total of his intervention was to order the burning buildings to be torn down to prevent further carnage and to commission Sir Christopher Wren to redesign St. Paul's Cathedral, which is still there today. But what happened next is remarkable. In the ashes of the destruction, private enterprise simply rebuilt the city in just 4 years. Bricks were now in great demand because they wanted to build using less flammable materials. This created jobs, of course, for construction workers. Servants who had been cast aside as the plague descended were now in demand again as people started moving into the new homes that had just been built. Historians have estimated that in today's money, earnings from tradesmen related only to the rebuilding efforts total about £7 billion. What was Charles II doing during this time? He was racking up private debts to Goldsmiths Bank to fund his increasingly lavish and randy lifestyle. In other words, he did nothing. It's curious how 300 years later, another randy ruler, Warren G. Harding, someone regularly touted for being the worst US president of all time, spent his time in office womanizing rather than intervening in economic affairs during an unemployment crisis. And yet, under his absentee watch, unemployment went from 11.7% in 1921 to 2.1% the year he died in 1923. Isn't it amazing what happens when government allows private enterprise to function unimpeded? In both cases, private enterprise was able to turn a situation in which things looked dire into one of growth and prosperity. Why? Well, it is because the destruction of one thing creates an opportunity for another thing, and the entrepreneurial spirit of human beings flourishes in such conditions. In 1942, the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpter came up with the most enduring description of this process in his masterpiece, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. He called it the perennial Gale of creative destruction. And his insight was that this process of the old ways of doing things being destroyed as new ways are found is absolutely central to capitalism and the creation of wealth and prosperity. Now, there are some excellent short explanations of Schumpeter's Gale online. Let's watch a couple of them here, and then I'll make some comments about how important this concept is and how it seems that neither those on the radical left nor those on the conservative right have ever quite understood it.
Take the ice industry in the United States, for example. Ice production has had a very interesting and unique history over the past several hundred years. Today, Americans consume tens of thousands of tons of ice every day. Ice consumption has become a regular part of the American daily life, as ice has hundreds of uses, including keeping food and drinks cold and icing injuries. Ice has not always been this readily available to the average person. Back in the 16th century, wealthy individuals would build personal ice houses on their property, cutting ice from nearby lakes and ponds in the winter months and transporting them to ice houses, storing it for use during the summer months. The commercial ice trade then began around 1800 in the United States. Large-scale ice mining operations sprang up, concentrated mostly in New England. These ice producers transported ice throughout the United States and much of the Caribbean. By 1818, ice was fetching nearly 25 cents per pound in the United States. That seems kind of affordable, 25 cents per pound. Well, compare that with what ice costs today. Ice currently costs about 10 cents per pound, even though we have seen inflation approximately 1,800% since then. The average income per capita in the United States in 1818 was $1,919 per year. Comparing that with the United States today, it is $49,965. What does it mean? Well, if we look at the price of ice as a percentage of income today compared to 1818, we found that 1 pound of ice took more than 65 times more income in 1818 than it does today. That is, if you buy ice commercially. In-home ice production is even cheaper. This means that in 1800s, ice could only be afforded by the wealthiest of individuals, and even then only in a limited capacity. Well, now that we've established how much cheaper ice is than it was 200 years ago, let's look at how many people are employed in the industry over the years. In 1914, near the height of the commercial ice industry, there were more than 2,500 companies producing ice, employing approximately 30,000 Americans. Then in 1950, the automatic ice maker was developed. By 1965, its use was widespread throughout the United States. This innovation dramatically changed ice production in the commercial ice industry. Today, the ice industry is vastly different. The majority of ice is now being produced by personally owned ice makers. With the onset of home ice makers, thousands of ice workers lost their jobs. Today, there are about 500 commercial ice producers that employ just over 7,000 workers. That is more than a 75% decrease in employment in the ice industry from 1914 to today. This is creative destruction on full display in the modern day. The massive ice industry of the early 1900s was replaced through innovation, and now we enjoy a much higher standard of living because of it, consuming more ice at a lower price and a higher quality than we ever have had before. Even though thousands of jobs are lost in the process, society as a whole has been made better off. Schumpter knew that at times the process of creative destruction in our society would be painful, especially in the short run. Creative destruction occurs in all kinds of industries today. Some individuals might be made worse off, not just in the short term, but perhaps throughout their lives. But he also knew that without creative destruction, that our economies would stagnate and we would never experience the growth and higher living standards that this process enables.
One of the reasons that no single person knows how to make a pencil is because the recipe for a pencil is in constant flux. This force of constant change in markets is called creative destruction.
Creative destruction simply means we are always finding ways to do more with less, to create better things that serve more people, that satisfy more wants and needs in more efficient ways.
Creative destruction is a process of change whereby new ways of doing things replace old ways of doing things.
Creative destruction, that is changing what we do, because that's what it is. That's all it means. That's what creative destruction means. Not doing things the same way we always did things.
In free markets, people adapt rather swiftly to creative destruction, to change, because it's in their self-interest to do so.
Because of creative destruction, free markets are incredibly dynamic. Over the last 200 years, the world has undergone dramatic changes that have made modern life almost unrecognizable to someone from an earlier era.
Barely a century ago, we were being transported, most of us, by horse. Today it's by automobile.
When I was a kid, icemen delivered ice to the house. The refrigerators eliminated that kind of job.
Airplanes replaced railroads as a way of getting from one end of the country to the other.
If we didn't have creative destruction, we'd still have cell phones that are enormous. Your cell phone is a brilliant piece of creative destruction.
Of course, these changes don't occur without a cost.
It's very, very easy to see the very visible costs associated with innovation, associated with trade, associated with change.
At the turn of the last century, let's say 1900, roughly 40% of Americans were in agriculture. Today, 3% of Americans are in agriculture. Well, those jobs were destroyed. If they were not destroyed, how in the world would we find the people to produce all those things that we have now that were not available in 1900?
What happens is that people save money, they can reinvest that money elsewhere, they can spend it on new things, they can create opportunities in other parts of the economy that might not be as obvious if we only focus on the costs.
In a world where our tastes never changed, our desires stayed the same, when no one innovated or improved any product, then I would guess you would not have much destruction, and you wouldn't have much creativity either.
Now, as you can see, creative destruction can wipe out thousands of jobs, but by focusing on the jobs lost, people never quite seem to see the new jobs created. All of this recent stuff about how the robots are coming to take away our jobs is extremely short-sighted. Imagine in 1973 you were a typewriter manufacturer, or maybe just someone who employed thousands of typists. Experts are saying, well, computers are on the horizon. One day they will destroy all the jobs in the typewriter manufacturing industry, and everyone currently employed as a typist will no longer have a job. What can we do? Well, some will cry, we should stop the computers from coming. But how many more jobs exist today, precisely because we have our computers? People struggle to see that entrepreneurs and private enterprise will reallocate resources, capital and labour to those newly productive areas at the expense of those areas which are no longer productive. Now, very frequently I hear the cry from those that worry that those unemployed people from the old industry will struggle to find work in the brave new world. All of the miners and the factory workers and so on who lost their jobs in the 1970s and 1980s, is it possible that none of them moved or reskilled or adapted to the new economy after 1979? I encounter this objection all the time in my internet travels, and I think it will be instructive to go through a real life argument I had. Let's take this exchange from Twitter with this physics PhD student from Hull just 2 days ago. He seems like a nice chap, but clearly could not wrap his head around the idea that the process of creative destruction could reallocate labour and resources without any government interference at all. Let's look at a few of our exchanges and see how the failure to grasp Schumpeter's Gale leads people to go so wrong. So here he is, he says, go on then. How exactly does the man on the ground in northeast England, failed by the education system, only really capable of factory work, and C, biology, too old to learn significantly different skills, benefit from all the factories moving to China? And I said, as millions actually did do in the 1980s, he reskills or moves. Who are all those IT managers? Where did all those professionals in London come from? Economic analysis must be dynamic, not static. You assume stable classes when people move in and out of income brackets all the time. He goes on, I specifically mentioned northeast England because it is by and large static and stagnant, and you've entirely sidestepped the issue of adults raised by their environment to be essentially incapable of reskilling to then have the environment change overnight. And I came back, the area is stagnant because of welfare, perverted incentives, etc. But that doesn't mean there are not many millions who moved or upskilled to compete in the new economy. Basic common sense tells you this. Working class accounted for 50% of the UK population in the 1950s and now only account for 25%. Did they all die? No. So I'm just saying that if you actually have a look at the breakdown of social demographics in the UK, the working class has shrunk and the middle class has grown. So how can he really be saying that people didn't move or upskill? Also, the irony seems to have escaped him that he's saying all of this while being a PhD student from Hull. This goes on. He says, if you're going to stand there and seriously claim that it's at all possible for ever-increasing percentages of people to be genuinely capable in areas like finance, engineering, etc., then you're too married to the asserted principles of liberty to see the realities. To which I responded, you're completely ignoring the hard data on this in favour of a narrative. How do you think that the real median wage now is £27,000 when the median wage adjusted for inflation in 1966 was $14,977? So this is something that leftists and people who like to argue in this way ignore all of the time. If it is really true that people cannot make this transition to new economic realities, then how could this real median wage have increased by this amount from 1966 until now? Yes, of course, there will be some people who in the short run are without jobs. But in the long run, you can see that people have a habit of readjusting. And in the long run, you can also see that people are better off, to the tune of about 10 grand. And this does not account for the fact that in 2018 the cost of everyday household goods is greatly below those of 1966. Now, dishonest newspapers like The Guardian like to point to the price of beer as being something that was lower in 1966 than it is today. But of course, we know that beer is one of those things that typically gets alcohol tax put on it by the government. Let's look at some of the other items. So I pulled up this data. I ran London prices in 1966, and then I went on the Tesco website and then just saw what the price of a standard Tesco product was today. These are the real prices. I'll just mention some of them. You can see that you can get 1.5 kilos of flour for 76p today. Would have cost you £1.77 in 1966. You can get a loaf of bread for 55p. It would have cost you £1.14 in 1966. You can see that today you can get sugar, kilo, for 69 pence. Would have cost you £1.35 back then. 50 pence for milk today. Would have cost you £2.80 back then. £1.60 for butter. Would have cost you £1.75 for butter back then. Interesting how that product hasn't moved much. But I'd be interested to have a little look into EU laws on butter to see if there's a little bit of intervention in there. Wouldn't be surprised. And the same for cheese. Look, £2.70 in Tesco today, £2.65 back then. I wonder if there's some little bit of regulation around dairy products for butter and cheese that is distorting that market. Commenters, you could look at that into your own time. I wouldn't be surprised. And then £1.35 for 2.5 kilos of potatoes. Today, £1.79 for potatoes back then. And bacon, just so happens that Tesco are doing a 2 for £3 deal on 300 gram packs of bacon. Today, 400 grams of bacon would have cost you £4.48 back then. So you can see that not only have real median wages almost doubled since 1966, but also the price of goods has come down, so you're getting more bang for your buck. And this is something that really isn't widely understood because, of course, everybody's got grandparents who will remember, a price of milk was only 16 pence when I was a girl. But the thing is, they're not accounting for inflation, and they're not accounting for real prices when they're doing that. So there's a distortion in the public consciousness that things were cheaper back in the day. Now, let's see where our friend from Hull goes next. He says, economic prosperity in London is also not especially interesting because it's almost entirely service and financial, neither of which are quote-unquote productive, and the latter of which is, by its intrinsic nature, out of the reach of the majority. You can't magic more people into the top N%. And I have said, incidentally, this is a favourite talking point of Thomas Sowell, the economist, who I mention frequently on this channel. I say economically illiterate again. Top 20% or bottom 20% are statistical constructions, not real people. I was in the bottom 20% when I was 21. Now I'm probably in the top 20%. Look at domestic migratory flows to and from London. Millions moved to London in their 20s and then out again. Between 2002 and 2011, London saw net inflows of 7.3 million and outflows of 6.8 million. London loses population in all age groups except ages 20 to 29. Where do these people come from and go? What do they do, and what would they have done in 1967? Well, and by this point, viewer, you should be filling in these answers yourself. Hopefully, I have brought you up to the point of economic literacy to be able to know what the answers to these questions are. That's right, if you're living in London, your colleague from, let's say, Liverpool or Manchester or Hull, who's sitting in the office, let's say you work at Microsoft or at Google or some other company, they would have been a coal miner in 1966. People can't seem to get this around their head. That's where the jobs have gone. Those people who now go to university and have moved around the country, they would have been doing those shitty jobs 40 or 50 years ago. These are the real effects of creative destruction. The one last tweet I'd like to share was actually a reply to my buddy geo-libertarian George. I said, "You're thinking like a static, central planning 1930s style Marxist. Who in 1988 might have dreamed that Sargon of Akkad could make £8,000 a month as a YouTuber? Or that people would pay Chinese World of Warcraft farms to do looting for them? The market is magic in many ways." And this is really the issue. People see others struggling or suffering misfortune in the short run, and their instinct is to intervene. It is to do something, to give them something. And yet, paradoxically, in the long run, the better policies were those pioneered by the Merry Monarch Charles II or the Playboy President Warren G. Harding. Namely, the government should do sweet FA, because the best people at reallocating capital to productive ends are entrepreneurs. The market is indeed magic in many ways. Till next time. And a very special thanks to Sir Percy Blakeney, the Crimson Satyr, Fonts, Graham Leggett, Ginger Bill, Michael Burt, Time Stealer, Blake Barrows, Charles Vincent, and Edward Darragh.